I said good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much. You all are the ones who came bright and early, and you're going to be rewarded with a feisty debate about college access and success. My name is Bridget Burns, and I'm the Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance, which is a national consortium of 11 large public research universities who are united around a sense of urgency that we're not doing enough to produce college graduates, and we're doing a terrible job with low-income students, and we think that going it alone to address those problems is a waste of time, energy, and money. So we work together, and that's where I am bringing my vantage point to this conversation is facilitating different institutions. However, what you're going to get a chance to hear is a variety of vantage points across the higher education spectrum on the topics of the day. There's a lot of urgency in the United States around the college completion agenda. And what we're seeing is that while some institutions are doing a relatively good job with college completion, it's not necessarily for all students. So that's what we're going to get to today, is this debate between access and success. Is there actually a fundamental difference between the two? Can we work on both, et cetera? So today we have the privilege of hearing from a variety of folks. The first of which is Carlo Salerno. Is Carlo, not Carlos, just to be clear. And he is the Vice President of Analytics for Strada, which formerly USA Funds. We also have Jonathan Burdick, who is the VP of Admissions, VP of Enrollment, or Dean of Admissions, VP of Enrollment at University of Rochester. And we also have, to his left, Nivine Megahed, who is the President of National Louis University. And finally, we have Todd Zipper, who is the President and CEO of Learning House. So you're going to hear a little bit from each one of them as we first kick off. I've been told to interject and to make this as feisty of a conversation as possible. No dueling speeches. So the only semblance of dueling speeches will begin right now, which is each of them is going to spend 1 minute explaining kind of their unique vantage point on this topic. So first, let's kick off. The topic of the day is higher ed, engines of mobility, on-ramps to higher education success. So Carlo, what is your unique perspective as VP of Analytics when you talk about access versus success and how higher education does a better job for students of all backgrounds?
So let me start by saying that what I'm speaking here about today is my own personal view as an education economist rather than Strada Education Network. But I am a higher education economist, and so I look at college success as a choice process. And so I come to this from the standpoint that I think if we look at numbers, you see that institutions, for those students who want to learn, actually do a remarkably good job of helping getting students in the door and helping them get through the process if they want to. So for me, the issue or the challenge, right, is in helping consumers make better choices to get into the right college, get into the right program, and to find and identify the right fit. I think if you look at the data and if you look at the national policy challenges today, what you see most often is that students and families come to the college choice process at a disadvantage, and they struggle to make good choices, and those bad choices that end up resulting end up leading to attrition rates, and they lead to dropouts, and they lead to dissatisfaction. And those are the challenges that I think we face today.
John, you're really in the heart of all of this, working in admissions and enrollment. Balancing those two hats, what do you see is the most significant challenge in this space, and what kind of unique vantage point do you bring?
Well, I mostly want to echo what Carlo said in the sense that I think I'm holding down the corner of the traditional nonprofit education sector, in this case both public and private, and if you want to say that we're the ones who have not addressed this problem sufficiently, I can't disagree with you, and you have to line up behind the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Cuomo administration, and the New York Times, and everybody else to sort of pillory and whip us and say we're not doing enough for low-income students, we're not doing enough to make a difference. I think I agree with that basic premise, and I think it's an important dialogue for us to have about how to do a better job across the board, but that's not the same thing as saying that the colleges doing what they're doing now aren't addressing this in many ways, that they aren't attentive to it, and that they aren't part of the solution, and that the models that they're following aren't part of that success. My personal experience has been that there are ways to take students from all income levels and all backgrounds and give them a meaningful opportunity to learn and grow and change and get better and produce more on the other side of that. And the worst thing that we could do is give up. My one theme, I think, would be that what's easiest to do in this space is to oversimplify. Rankings are oversimplifications, rating systems are oversimplifications, tables and charts that rank colleges are oversimplifications, and none of that is a great source for policy answers.
Nivine, you serve a large number of low-income first-generation college students. Can you give us a little bit more perspective as a president of an institution that's a fairly unique institution? How do you look at this debate between access versus success?
So I took improv for a year. I was terrible at it, but the thing I learned to say always was yes, and. I think that there has to be a deliberate decision to serve this population, and I'm not sure that I believe that has happened broadly within our sector. And I think that when you make that deliberate decision to do so, there are a lot of then demands that are required in order to serve that sector incredibly well, and I'm talking about sort of low-income first-generation students. I also think that if you look at the changing demographics in our country, increasingly we are a nation that has more and more Latino and students of color, and they are not entering and or completing college at the same rate as our Caucasian counterparts. So I do think it's sort of a moral imperative to address this issue, and I think that it is a complicated issue, but there's a lot of data and research out there to suggest what are the pathways to pursue to do it well, and I'd like to see more people doing it.
Todd, as you assist institutions and work with a multitude of them as a CEO, what different perspective do you bring to the table compared to the colleagues that you've heard thus far?
Well, we work with about 50 universities in a variety of ways as an academic program manager with online education, coding boot camps, now continuing education for K-12 teachers, as well as international recruitment. And our universities are tuition dependent. And so for them, they've been in, frankly, survival mode for the better part of the last decade. And they need to not just solve for student success, but they also need to solve for access. They don't have gates really letting people in. So every day, what we're trying to do with our partners is to create an incredible student experience that we think both increases access and also follows through on student success.
Okay. So just to give a little bit more framing on this, right now we're allegedly at a space where we have a shortfall of college degrees in the United States, somewhere around 16 million, if you look at Carnevale's numbers. And so we're not producing degrees at the pace that the economy needs us to. And then if you were born into a low-income family, back in the 1970s, you had a 6% chance of getting a college degree, and now after all this progress, it's now 9%. So we've made very little progress for serving the most vulnerable students, and we need to produce more college degrees. When we talk about that achievement gap, which each of you touched upon, John, I want you to talk a little bit about this perspective on the achievement gap that you, how do you look at the achievement gap for low-income students versus high students, the delta in outcomes between institutions?
Well, I hope that you could say as a matter of policy or as a matter of market imperative that every institution is trying to confront it deliberately and not ignoring that even if it's a question of survival, it's also a question of mission. Who are you serving? And if the student demographics are changing or the students we're serving are not then leading us forward as an economy or as a country, then I think we all have to pay attention to that. I think there are models that work at all levels of student achievement prior to entering college. There are models that work at all levels of college income, from $40 billion endowment all the way down the scale. And I think we need to be data-driven and look at each of one of those models and say this is or is not succeeding, and give power to those that are and shine a light on those that are not.
Okay, but we're failing half of all students who walk in the door. So Carlo, can you talk, or Nivine, either of you, I would like to get a sense, because this is supposed to be a feisty debate, when you admit a student and they drop out, is it the student's fault or the institution's?
Do you want to go first? Ladies first.
I think depending on the situation, it could be both. I think it's important that institutions think of themselves as much being student ready instead of is the student college ready. Mm-hmm. And so if an institution is student ready, you can really try to address a lot of the variance that happens that does end up being, attrition ends up being the result of the institution not supporting the student appropriately. And I think in some situations, there's just a lot of life circumstances you cannot overcome. But the point is, if an institution, you can only control what you can control. If you become student ready as an institution and you're doing what you can to support this population, you're going to get a lot more students through than you're currently getting through. And the goal is to, the ideal goal is to get to 100%. But gosh, if we can just move from the 20 or 30% number for low-income students to 60%, that will have been huge. So it obviously can be both.
So Carlo, you look at this from an analytics perspective. How can analytics inform that becoming student ready or redesigning the institution around student success?
Can I answer the same
Oh, you
question
can.
had, though,
Yes,
first?
you can, but then this next one's coming.
And then the next. Look, I mean, both sides have a responsibility in the process, right? I mean, any service industry has a responsibility to its consumers, and consumers have their own responsibility to use the resources that are put at their disposal, right? We could talk about failing institutions, or institutions failing their students, but we have to ask ourselves some sort of basic fundamental questions, right? For example, right? What college says, I want to enroll 2,000 students and I'm going to let 50% of them drop out, right? That's 50% of my cohort that I'm going to now have to go through enrollment management again and fill seats with. These are folks who are going to leave my institution and they're going to probably not have a very positive public perception about it, so I'm going to spend marketing dollars. In all likelihood, we know with a good deal of certainty, if they don't complete and they took on student loans, they're probably going to struggle to pay those loans back. Now as the college, I have to actually go and pay for default prevention services. I mean, folks, at the end of the day, if colleges could control the outcomes that we like to think that they control related to these students, why would they choose to behave this way? Why would they choose to absorb all these costs? Imagine if Ford Motor Company said, you know what? We're comfortable putting out 2,000 cars and we're happy that 1,000 of them are junk. That's ridiculous. That's just absurd that anybody would take on that perspective. So I think we have to step back a little bit and say, what can the college control and what can the student control? And I think if you sort of look at it, again, it comes down to a choice process, right? I mean, students in colleges look less like factories and they look more like health clubs, right? Colleges provide a whole bundle of resources for students. Students take advantage of those resources. They make their own education. They graduate. This is why people skate by with C's and other people, happily go through with A's. If colleges could control a lot of the things that we hold them to the fire for, they would look a lot different today. No student would ever, marginally eke by in a class, right?
I don't agree with you. I think that many of them can control those things if they were actually mindfully aware of the analytics.
I think
most of them have a lot of indicators based on their historical data of where students drop out. They just aren't very self-aware and they haven't actually done the hard work of upgrading their analytics so they can be reactive and anticipatory. Most of them are playing defense instead of offense.
Let me jump into
Yeah,
that
go
debate
ahead.
with you.
Then I'm going to talk to Todd.
So, I mean, it's a traditional perspective you're presenting because, again, there is a lot of data out there. So we know, particularly for low-income students, that if you have clearer pathways for them, there's a much higher rate of success. But do you see that happening for low-income students across the country? No. We know that if you put in success coaches for students that work with them to help them because they address many more obstacles, that they have a higher rate of success. Do people do that across the country? No, not as a whole. There's a sector that is, but not as a whole. We know that if we see them engage in the class and can measure that and help to increase engagement in the classroom, they're going to be more successful and they're going to actually perform better. But does everyone look at that data and then work to make sure students engage? No. And the places that are doing it are seeing higher rates of success. So the data is out there clear as day. We know DevEd helps. We know if you do it in a particular way, which co-curricularly, students will succeed better. But is everyone doing that as a sector across the country? No, because people do think of their colleges as these health this boutique where you can do all these things, as opposed to addressing this particular. This is a deliberate decision that must be made, and these students have to be subject to the best practices out there in order for us to move the dial on student completion in this country.
Todd, you work with 50 different institutions. I know it's killing you right now. Todd, no, I'm trying to make this interesting, man. Got to mix it up. Todd, you work with 50 different institutions. Is it your perspective that institutions are designed around the student or they're designed around teaching?
Well, I mean, I think that's the quintessential issue, and we're trying to flip that. I think it's a little bit of both, but we're trying to, frankly, make it more about the student. To me, there's not enough accountability in the system. So we have this little parallel going on in our universe with coding boot camps. If we don't retain nearly 100% of those students, if we don't get people jobs in the 80, 90% range, we're out of business, right? Colleges don't have that same framework. So I think if we don't create that accountability system in our higher ed universe, I think we're always going to be struggling. That's my first point. Secondly, for us, we're trying to create an we call enrollment to retain philosophy, right? So when we're bringing the student in, we're thinking, is this the right program? Can they be successful? Do we have success coaches in the right ratios that can work with them along the way? Do we have the analytics that we're looking at all these red flags so we can stop it, change degree plans, do different things along the way? So I think there's a lot of strategies that we can do, but we're also at a smaller scale, right? So we're dealing with 50 or so institutions, 10,000 or so overall students. We can do that at that scale. How do you get to doing it with 1 million students or community colleges that are graduating 20% and just keep bringing them in? That's a bigger issue.
I think part of the poison that's in the higher education system is this idea that we are still producing a uniform thing called a college graduate that then makes their way in this world. It's this industrial hangover, and there's no truth to it in any of the sectors of the economy, but especially true in higher education. And the problem is that for 35 or 40 years, driven by a lot of external impulses, this has become a marketing phenomenon. We're saying that we can produce college graduates of X type faster or cheaper or better than somebody else does. And that's not what these 3,000 colleges in the United States should be doing. They should each be defining their own mission to produce people for their own communities, or if they're on a national scale, And that's a kind of accountability. It can be data-driven. It can produce the outcome we're all seeking collectively, but it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And that's the problem now, is that we're all being ranked on this one-size-fits-all list as if that's a meaningful way to interpret what your experience is going to be. Now, maybe 80% of those in the rankings really ignore that and still try to do what they can do, and they're working at the margins. But the problem is the tone is set, and the media is obsessed about what's going on in that top 10 or 20% as if that's the most meaningful indicator of success. And it's not. It never has been, and it isn't going to be.
Carlo, let me have it.
So I mean, all joking aside, I think it's remarkably insulting to any institution to suggest that they don't spend a lot of time looking at the data that they have when it comes to enrollment management, when it comes to monitoring academic performance on different levels, when it comes to trying to keep students in the system as best as they can. They have every academic and economic incentive to get people through the pipeline. In that respect, colleges and students are extremely well aligned. Students, they want to find a college, they want to graduate, they want to complete, they want to get a good job, and they want to go make a lot of money. Institutions, they want to get a student in the door once, they don't want attrition, they want that student to graduate, they want that student to go earn a lot of money, and they like to give a little bit back to the school eventually afterwards. Schools and institutions are actually remarkably well aligned. It doesn't mean that there isn't room for better data, right? We could add more data to the system. We could do some more predictive analytics. We can try and understand where people fall off the tracks. But to say that that institutions don't do this already, I don't think is fair. I don't think that's fair at all.
They'd like to, and the intention, the will is there. Don't interpret my comment to mean that I think the campuses don't want to do this. It's that campuses are incredibly overburdened. They have to be everything to everyone. They have to be focused on efficiency and producing research and knowledge and discovery, and then graduates. And they have some new policy request coming from the legislature on a monthly basis, and so they're constantly reacting. And so being fully aware of the historical data and having their indicators locked in and having responses to those triggered and everything laid out is very rare.
Sure, but we also know that institutional performance is tied very heavily to the inputs that they bring into the process, and that's students, right? We're getting sucked into the New York Times trap right now, where we're thinking about a small set of institutions when half of this country goes to community colleges that are non-selective institutions. These are schools that have to take on students from all walks of financial and academic preparation life, and they have to mold these folks into graduates. And that's a hard thing to control. That's a remarkably difficult thing to control.
You hit on it, because we work with mostly adult learners, and I think Mitch Daniels brought it up and has kind of publicized this, 30 million plus people with some college. We want to talk about solving access and student success. Let's solve how we deal with students with some college, the transfer credit friendliness of schools. That is an issue that almost every time we go into a university, they're not prepared at all to deal with transfer, from other institutions or even from dropouts, right? And that's the bulk of the college market today. So the question is, are people looking at lots of data? Yes. Are they looking at the right data and trying to solve the right problems? I don't necessarily think so.
I think what you're saying is correct. The students and alumni and colleges are all working in sync together with the same set of goals and the same set of measurements to try and achieve them. But there are other stakeholders, and the biggest forgotten stakeholder is state taxpayers / voters and citizens who have a stake in all this kind of stuff. And the truth is, even though that they should have been yelling and screaming for the last 30 or 40 years, all the yelling and screaming that gets amplified through the media is from parents, as if this is only a private good and what happens to their students is all that matters on a personal level, not their status as people in that state or in that community. And the other set of forgotten stakeholders that needs to be thought about was in operation for the last 12 years or 10 of the last 12 years in a big way, which was investors. And what they were choosing to do with those students was in some ways at the for-profit colleges, was in some ways very different than the set of incentives and patterns that goes on at traditional higher education.
Nivine, you're actually running an institution with multiple bases. So you're actually doing all of this. So what are we missing from this conversation? We're making all these assumptions about what the decisions that leadership makes and how campuses react to things. So as someone who actually has to do this, what piece is missing?
Well, I agree with a lot of what I'm hearing, and I think that we do have a very diverse ecosystem in higher education, and you can't judge everything equally. What I would say is that that there are different stakeholder audiences that you're serving in higher ed today, and that I'm not sure that I hear a true understanding of what that audience requires to be successful. And each of them has some unique challenges affiliated with them. And I guess I come back to the idea of, do institutions think of themselves as student ready to address those diverse stakeholders? And I get there's a lot of other stakeholders out there, but at the end of the day, hopefully we know that we're there to serve students. I also think, Carlo, that you're talking about, well, what institution doesn't get that it's important to retain students and graduate them and all that? So I would say that amongst leadership teams and institutions, boy, they get it, because they're talking about those high-level metrics that drive their institution. But to get that driven down all the way through what is often a very distributed system in an institution is a whole other story. So, is that enrollment representative on the front lines thinking about, it's important to retain this student all the way through? I'm not sure. Is that faculty member thinking it's important for me to give this student the right experience so that they retain all the way through? I don't know that that is what's front of mind for 80% of the people providing service within the institution. And that may be one of the issues that institutions really need to work on to drive down that value system so that people get it.
I'm just trying to get back to the more general point, right? That it feels, the conversation feels very parochial, in that we're deciding what's best for students and what we need students to do and how we need to help students. I mean, people make choices about what they want to do. People's lives dictate the paths that they take. We can influence, but we can't control a lot of these things. And I think what we're trying to do is force institutions into this position to sort of take accountability for what individual effort, ends up achieving at the end of the day. And it's really hard, again, going back to the community college example, right? When you bring somebody in who has a mortgage and kids and a full-time job, or maybe they're, they didn't get good academic preparation, or maybe their finances are tight, and we try and push them through a system and those folks fail and they don't run through the system, I can think of 100 reasons why that person didn't succeed that has nothing to do with the institution.
I think the only thing that misses is that there is a reason to keep a fire under the butts of people at the top of the enrollment period and at the colleges and what they're doing, and that is that they have ridiculously outsized influence on what goes on in the secondary level. And so if a college says we want students who've taken every possible AP or every possible hard course that they've taken and earning X grades and earning X scores and doing all that, if they say that, then that drives the entire system to try and maximize that for a subset of the population. It's not achievable across the board. The College Board crows about AP in 2,000 high schools. Well, there's thousands of, or 20,000 high schools, there's thousands of high schools that aren't there and aren't going to get there in a hurry. It's not going to happen overnight that that's the case. So colleges do have to take some responsibility for whether or not they're reaching the populations that Nivine has designed her institution to reach through what they communicate about what's valuable and important.
And they totally do. They totally do. I'm not saying it, for the record, I am not saying that institutions have no accountability here in this process. I'm simply saying that if we want to move the needle on completion and success, moving that needle starts with focusing on the consumer more than focusing on the institution. And that if you can better align consumers to understand what the institutions that they're applying to offer and what the programs that they're going to enroll in are going to lead to later on in life, you're going to get better outcomes than trying to force institutions to play this game, because the institutions, if you stick performance measures against me, arbitrary performance measures like graduation rates or completion rates or attrition rates, I'm going to do the first thing that makes me meet those measures, which is I'm going to go get the students that I know are going to complete anyway. I'm basically going to subvert your entire performance-based system and just go bring in the best students I possibly can.
I'm gonna just jump in here, maybe change the dialogue a little bit. You know, I think we could all agree that students want lower tuition. We're trying to solve here access. We're trying to solve student success. This is a real issue for students, and they're paying a lot of money. It's too much money. They got to drop out. Issues like this. I think we need to talk more about that as a big issue because that's obviously been a runaway issue for the last several decades of higher ed and tuition. And I think there's a lot of solutions for that. You know, I think that what the reality is, the internet has solved that issue for a lot of industries. It has not solved it in higher education for the most part. And we're sitting on these great solutions like MOOCs or competency-based education or adaptive learning. And so, you know, for us, we come in there, we actually work with schools to lower their tuition for their online programs because they are saving money on their cost side. Whereas we see a lot of competitors of ours or schools indirectly keeping the tuition the same, or even in some cases greater online. So I'm just trying to switch the dialogue a little bit to say, how do we solve some problems that can indirectly or directly increase access or student success? And I think we have a lot of ways to solve the tuition issue.
Is it also that it's not just that tuition is high, it's that the outcome is not guaranteed and frankly unproven in many cases, where students are not getting jobs. They're not actually getting the outcomes that we've been putting out in posters for quite some time.
Where do you get that? A 4.4% unemployment rate in this country and they're not getting jobs?
Good, so I'm glad that we're responding to that pervasive narrative that higher education is not worth it. I mean, so would you respond to the recent unveiling of Mission U?
The unemployment rate for college graduates is 2.8% right now. You couldn't have possibly a more full economy. That is not the belief in the public,
though. Why is there such a disconnect between
because there's data on like first-year students are at 20% unemployment and are working at Starbucks. Like you could find data to support whatever you want. The reality, I think we all know,
those aren't data,
is
they're
that
anecdotes.
people with bachelor's degrees make more money than people without bachelor's degrees.
Great.
And there's an ROI there for sure. So then it's like, okay, so we can keep charging $50,000 a year. But you can't, because I think we're still missing the value cost equation here, that people, you know, unlike the boot camp model, you're giving $12,000 and you're seeing your salary increase. There's such a disconnect between that because the taxpayers, Jonathan said, you know, they don't even know where their money is going, right? You know, in half the time, or what the outcomes are. And so that's, you know, I think the college scorecard things, we need to create more visibility around accountability, and then I think that will trickle through the system to course correct.
I mean, I'm hopeful, but I feel like the public narrative is very much disconnected from the reality in higher education.
Well, the public is responding in part to the fact that colleges are relatively insulated from economic sways, but they're not immune. So we're now starting to see, and there's predictions of greater amounts of colleges literally failing, not being able to meet their target and follow. We've seen a few, they're high profile because there's so few at the moment, but eventually that will become a fairly standard story, that colleges are just closing.
Do you have something to add in this space?
Well, I think that I'm torn because I'm a believer that colleges should help with the employment equation. And the fact is that one of the reasons I'm a believer in that, particularly when you're dealing with first gen and underserved students, is that working with some of the schools within the city of Chicago where they have gotten students through Harvard or Yale or some of the Ivy Leagues, despite all obstacles, these kids will make it all the way through, and then we see them graduated working at McDonald's. And why? Because despite the fact that they made it through a great education, they don't have the metacognitive skills, the career bridging resources to help them make the transition to employment. So the issue when you're dealing with a population, which is a growing population in this country, I mean, I know in the state of Illinois alone, 50% of our kids are growing up in poverty, So being the biggest, and it's the biggest obstacle to getting higher education. So if you do all the support and you get them through and they still don't have the requisite support and skills in the transition to employment, then I would argue that as an institution we have failed. So I believe in the stats, but I also sort of see the level of the individual, and I see the level in which there is adverse impact on those who have so few resources. And I feel like in a way we have to hold ourselves accountable to help make up for that, even though we didn't create it, but if we can help make the transition for these students, we can help to really change the trajectory of our economy and the health of our communities.
Todd, you work directly with this space, this place of not just educating the student, but also the gap between education and employment. Do you have anything to add in this space?
You know, I think that it to me, one of the goals of Learning House right now is to track employability. Just track it for our schools, because nobody's even tracking it. And then they lose the person afterwards and they try to link in with them or something like that. So to me, that's where we are as an industry right now. So I think we need to start with that, and then you can obviously see where your ultimate gaps are there. But I completely agree with Nivine here, where we need more also life skills training. This is something we do a lot of in our student success coaching model, right? So, you know, I'm a parent of 3 kids, and I'm seeing our kids learn about Carol Dweck's mindset and Angela Duckworth's grit. Colleges are not addressing any of those issues, or organizational skills, or any of these executive function life skills. I mean, what would happen if our colleges en masse did that? I think you'd see people with a lot more purpose, a lot better going into the workforce. So I think there's a ton that colleges can do within, you know, where they are today.
I think it's another case where colleges catch up slowly. The word from corporate America or corporate world is that it's actually not the data analytical skills and the other STEM-based skills that they are worried about. It's the soft skills. It's the ability to communicate, the ability to adapt, the versatility, the chance to intersect with a variety of different kinds of people. And colleges are talking about that, but you're absolutely right. They have not yet addressed that in the way that they should as an issue of employability.
Carlo, this is right in your wheelhouse because of completion with a purpose at Strada, so can't wait to hear.
So I mean, again, this is in a planned economy, you know, this would be great. This would all sound really nice, but we don't live in a planned economy, right? People choose what degrees they want to enroll in. People pick the majors that they want to pursue. When we look at Department of Education statistics and we see this massive imbalance of folks who go into degrees that have lower employment and lower income earning options, and fewer people who enroll in the high demand, higher paying job fields, again, if we could control these things and we could assign and allocate people, that's fine, but we don't put guns to people's heads. They choose what they want to enroll in. They choose what they want to get their degree in, and that affects them when they get into the labor market, right? At the end of the day, they make the choice, and then they go out into the labor market. One of the challenges that we found over time is that, and this is just a basic human nature problem, right, is that everybody thinks they're better than the average, right? Everybody goes into this thinking, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to get a job. I'm going to earn the most money. I'm going to be better than the average person in my field. Because we don't bet against ourselves. Nobody bets against themselves. Nobody walks in and says, you know what, I'm probably going to fail. Or nobody walks in and says, you know what, I'm going to be a mediocre engineer, right? We don't do that. We don't walk into it. So we set ourselves up, right? And so we follow training paths. We get into the labor market. And then we don't realize that, okay, I got my bachelor's degree in sociology, engineering, whatever, right? I'm going into the labor market. Now I'm competing with a whole bunch of well-established folks, and I'm competing with a whole bunch of folks that are probably unemployed, looking for work, but who already have a credential and some employment experience. Technically, I'm already behind the 8 ball to begin with. I mean, there's a lot of challenges to moving into the labor market. We want people to get jobs. The whole purpose I hate the fact that the department has ruined the term gainful employment, but that's what this is. This is, for most people who go into higher education, it's to get gainful employment. And so we're always looking for ways to do that.
I disagree with the planned economy statement because the federal government is just giving out billions and billions of dollars without retribution on the return on investment of that. So we're effectively this quasi-capitalist, quasi-planned economy. I mean, I think, and again, I think you go to the boot camp space of there's no plan around that or not. If employers don't like what they get, they walk away and that's it. I think if we created more accountability on all those dollars being doled out, then I think the universities would tweak their strategies around, are we going to actually graduate people that are going to be gainfully employed?
Sure,
What
but
is-
we're,
what-
but
what
we're
is
not
that
the so, but
accountability?
we're
If you
not the
want to
Soviet
produce
Union
anxiety
in
in
the
a room,
1980s,
try a planned
right?
economy in China in terms of what they feel about higher education. They are far more angst-ridden than we are about what's going on in their higher education system.
We just struck a zesty tone. All right, so listen, we're not trying to bum you out. It's the morning. So I would like to pivot to talking about things that we know are actually working to address access and success. So first, Nivine, you are working uniquely with these students' populations. Can you share with us one thing that folks can walk away with that you have seen as an exemplary in terms of making a difference for low-income first generation or students of color?
So there's one that I had the pleasure of telling Bill Gates last year because I said it's so simple, but it's like shocking to me to see it. We used an adaptive learning platform for our students in this program. And I call it adaptive learning 1.0 because I think adaptive learning is going to improve over time. But the thing that was so powerful was that you could see if students engaged with the material. Basically, were they doing their work? And if they did their work, they improved, period. No matter where they came from, what level they were at. It was like no one could say, my dog ate my homework, I did it, but they really didn't. You could actually see it, and it was used for intervention to help students who oftentimes didn't connect that they weren't doing the work, and that's why they were struggling along. And it's so simple, but just that visibility from a technology perspective to see how much effort the student was making outside of the classroom was so powerful.
Todd, what is something that you think is actually adding positively to this space? I know you work in the coding space, but you're also seeing what else is happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few points. I mean, one, time and time again, it's not just unique to Learning House and our partners. Having a very focused and thoughtful retention strategy, including retention coaches or online academic advisors or whatever it is, works. I mean, the average adult learner is something like 47% year over year retention rate. We're up to like 82%, right? And a lot of our peers are as well. So I think that absolutely works. And then the analytics that go around looking at the data and then making changes to your curriculum based on that. I think master course philosophy. I think when you're trying to manage quality and consistency is huge for big institutions, right? Because you have lots of different sections going on, no control over what's happening. We think that's working really well. Some things, I mentioned transfer credit policies, that really helps, keep retaining. I mean, we have a whole host of things that are working that I don't want to take away from my panel here, but what else? The thing that I think is starting to happen in the boot camp space, income share agreements, and we have a proposal out now for that. I would love to see that more in the college space. I believe actually Purdue has the back-a-boiler concept that they announced. I mean, Milton Friedman talked about it like 50 years ago. It makes a ton of sense if you can, and there's lots of funding sources to do that, whether it's working with banks or whatnot. That's putting your money where your mouth is. I do think that will help, although we don't really have a lot of test cases on that.
John, what are you seeing that's promising for your institution?
Well, my perspective is a bit narrow in the sense that there absolutely is a correlation for success at my place with how much preparation students have achieved during high school before they come there. And we've gotten a lot bigger, and we can get bigger still, but that's almost always going to be the case. There's going to be a slice that we're doing. So I would talk about what works on the secondary level as the best strategy. And what we found is it's not test scores, and it's not AP classes or anything like that that's the primary achievement. It's good teaching. And in particular, there's an enormous bump up if a student has good teaching 3 years in a row. So if we could be making better and more comprehensive strategic investments in great teaching at the secondary level, we would be going the longest way towards solving this problem, because we were bringing all the boats up to access your place and my place and every place around to be more successful once they get there.
Carlo, what are you seeing in the field that you think is the most promising, especially with your analytics hat?
So again, I would defer to what Todd said on income share agreements, because I think one of the biggest humps, right, to getting folks in the door to begin with is being able to break through this perception that college is a good investment. We know, hands down, that going to college is one of the best decisions you can make, but it's really difficult to make a $20,000, $50,000, $80,000 investment and be able to look 30 years out and get that that's a deal, especially if you only make $60,000 a year as a family or $70,000. That's a big slug of money, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year in tuition or in borrowing. So getting folks over this hump of can I afford it, because you can afford it, It's just different people have different perspectives on how they can afford things. And we know that there are certain groups that are just averse to debt to begin with. They just don't like taking on debt, and I understand that. Within the institution themselves, right, I think retention solutions are like the super obvious choice, right? I mean, if I'm in the system, there's no reason on earth why if I'm a sophomore and I'm a D+ student and I'm over borrowing that my institution shouldn't be flagging me as a warning indicator that I could be falling off the tracks and should be imposing some kind of intervention. The challenge is the data, because all the data that needs to be pulled together to sort of make that sort of assessment of a risk profile for a student is siloed in a lot of different parts of the institution. The challenge institutions face is how do we pull all that data together in a cost-efficient way so that we can do this sort of logical tracking and monitoring, right? There are ways that institutions can quite easily go in and start being able to catch folks before they fall off the track, rather than have to spend the time afterwards trying to deal with it.
Okay, so there have also been some recent announcements of some programs or initiatives that might be nibbling around these issues. So one, free college. So John, you're in a state that has just made a very bold decision, and I'm wondering what your perspective is on this free community college program, or free college.
It's really bold for people up to $125,000 in household income who are not going to risk taking longer than 4 years to graduate, and then are going to stay in New York for at least 4 years after they graduate. So it's a pretty narrowly defined definition of boldness. But I would offer this perspective. I lived and worked in California for most of my career, first half of my career and more. And in California, I watched through every cycle of economic downturn. When the state government's coffers were falling empty, they would turn to the UCs and say, you need to cut costs, you need to share costs. And you would say, fine, we're going to cut 10,000 students out of our system. So the idea that free college is somehow an access program is a mislabeling and a misnomer. It's an access system when you're flush and you are willing to extend that. When the flush goes away and the colleges have no incentive to enroll more students, then all of a sudden you've got this whole new problem where you are actually denying access to a greater number of people.
Yeah,
so it's a chimerical approach.
Yeah, between what Carlo said and John, college is very affordable in a lot of places. It's getting the great instruction at scale at a lot of these great public universities in New York that you just can't get. So now all of a sudden it's free. I mean, between Pell Grants and their tuition, it's free anyway. It's kind of free, So it's a little bit of a political thing, as a as a New York resident.
I think really quickly, I think the litmus test for me for free college is that if you look at OECD statistics, right, and you look at countries that have historically charged no tuition or extremely low tuition, and you look at the percentage of their adult populations who have college degrees, they're almost the same as what we have today. So if there was a needle bump, if there was a movement to actually driving down tuition to zero that would result in some massive amount of higher education being consumed by individuals and people getting college grads, we would have seen this in Germany. We would have seen this in France. We would have seen this in a lot of Western Europe over the past 20 years. And the fact that we haven't is as good of evidence we have as any that tuition alone does not guarantee access or improve degree outcomes.
Nivine, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, these are interesting perspectives. I always think there's no such thing as free. And the fact of the matter is if you really believe in access, rather than making something free, put in the support students need to be successful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's where you need to invest, and that's how you move your dial.
So other innovative strategies that we're hearing about, last week we heard about Purdue purchasing Kaplan. Anyone have any responses to that or thoughts on how that will affect, especially because they want to focus on the adult learner population, where we're hearing a lot that we're not serving that population? Todd?
I was a former Kaplanite. I mean, I'm a little sad, but I think it's great for both parties, honestly. I mean, Kaplan's brand in the higher ed space is just not going to go anywhere at this point. Purdue's brand and its, in theory, perceived quality control, infrastructure will allow it to basically for $1 acquire all this incredible infrastructure, because there's a lot of good stuff that Kaplan is doing from the academic to the student service side that they haven't been doing. And knowing that Purdue is behind the 8 ball a little bit on serving adults, I think it's kind of a win-win. I mean, we'll see what happens in a few years if they can economically make it work for everybody. I'm sure if they go from 32,000 students to 10,000, something will go wrong in that economic equation.
Carlo, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, you either build what you have or you buy what you have, or what you need. And I think in this case, you know, Purdue's making a very sensible decision to try and help tap into a market, and rather than build the infrastructure, acquire the infrastructure. And I think, you know, brand matters. And I think that they wouldn't do the deal if they didn't feel like they wouldn't be sacrificing their brand in the process. So they feel there's quality there.
I'm mindful that the freak out when that announcement came out felt very similar to when the ASU Starbucks partnership was announced. And now that we're a couple years into that partnership, we're seeing that there are tremendous outcomes, and actually it's been an incredibly successful program. So I guess we'll all wait and see. But any final words or comments from you all? We have just under 5 minutes, and I feel like we got some feistiness out of you, which is what I promised in terms of your morning coffee. But any last words from each of you about this dilemma that institutions often perceive that they are facing? If they have to choose between access and success, what is your advice to them? Carlo, let's start with you.
Again, look, I mean, I'm being confrontational this morning because I feel like it's far more interesting to listen to than to, you know, just in a drone. But, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, both are important. But I feel like if I'm an institution and I have a choice between managing access or managing success, I have a better job of managing success than I have managing access, right? Again, if you go back to the perspective that half of this nation goes to community colleges and around 60% of the four-year going college population goes to a largely low selective to non-selective state university, you know, a lot of institutions take in students and have to work with what they have. And so I think they do a good job. I think we just need to give them more tools and more opportunity. I think everybody wants completion, and they're all driving towards it.
John, what about you?
Thinking about Purdue and Kaplan and the ASU Starbucks partnership, I think what's key for me is that there's so many different interesting, innovative things going on, most of them relying on real data, occasionally going based on other kinds of impressions, or occasionally just being bold. What's valuable is if we can allow those to happen and not find ourselves driven by the unholy trinity of Upper East Side, New York Times reading campaign donors sort of setting the tenor for what needs to happen to everybody. If we can stay clear of that, we'll be fine, even including the free tuition idea. They all have validity, they all have interest, and they let a marketplace flow, and then we'll find which ones prove to be best.
As someone who actually has to make this decision on a daily basis as a president of an institution, what are your thoughts?
I think both can be pursued simultaneously, that access and success. Again, if you make a deliberate decision that both have to occur, you can do it. And I hope more institutions go there. I think it's really critical. I'd also say that it's very, one of the things about scaling in a place where you're both pursuing access and success is you can't do it without the human equation. And I heard someone earlier talking about, well, there's MOOCs and all that. Those will never address the issues of low-income, underserved students until you address the human equation in the delivery of those programs. Because more than anything, students who come from underserved or low-income backgrounds need additional supports, and I don't think technology yet can mimic the kind of human support they need to be successful. So the models always have to figure that part out with it.
Todd.
So first, I mentioned, I think we need to get serious about accountability. I think that will allow for a lot of innovation and solutions to naturally occur. We didn't talk a lot about the idea that over the last decade or so, merit-based scholarships have basically grown a lot through the discounting process versus need-based scholarships. And I think there's a lot of strategy. We talk about, the ISA there. And I think we've had several institutions of ours go to the one price model, so there's really no discounting, and that's actually increased access in many ways for those institutions. It's been wonderful. I think there's a lot of, I guess my answer is, I think there's a ton of best practices out there to solve for, it's not easy, to be clear, but to solve for the success need. I agree with Carlo, that kind of has a notch above access to me, because I think if you solve that, you could then go and tackle access, because the reality is the for-profits tackled access over the last decade or so, and they ran into problems by doing that. So I think you got to focus on success first and then get to access.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming this morning, and please join me in thanking my panelists from this panel. All right, good morning.